All right, let's talk a little bit about Photoshop Composite images, or Photoshop Compositing as it's sometimes called. Here's an image I created for a client that was a staff photo. They were all dressed up as nerds, as you can tell, and they wanted to create this nerd poster. So what I did, initially, I took a bunch of photos of them all together, but if you've ever tried to do that, you'll know that anything more than about 3 people in a photo gets difficult. It's really tough to get everybody making the face that they want, whether it's smiling or in this case, they kind of have a serious vibe going on. But what I ended up doing to create this image was I took a picture of all of them. Let's take a look here separately. And the way I did that was went in and set my camera up on a tripod and then had them all step in and I took a photo. Now one thing you'll notice as I did this, I had them all try and stand on this line or as close to this line as I could get them to stand. That way I had a frame of reference as I cut these images out and brought them into Photoshop. You can see here I've got a line across the top of this machine and it gave me a really good idea of how tall they were, so that way I could make a really believable depth of field. Some of these photos are just ridiculous, sorry. Anyway, all right, so what we did here, let's go ahead and open up this file and take a look. I'm going to open up Photoshop, and because the poster file was one of the most recent files that I opened, it's going to be in my recent files list here. There it is right there. And let's take a look. So what I did when I created this image, and you can see here I've got these guides. And these guides help me see how tall everybody is when I brought them in, cut them all out, and if I click on any of these and drag them around, all of a sudden it totally breaks the illusion, if it didn't already with me telling you. But we can cut all these people out, drop them in. You'll see I added some drop shadows by their feet. Let's take a look here. Let's zoom in a little bit. So I've got their feet here. Let me double click. These are smart objects. What that means is it remembers what the original file was set up as. So I've got an inner shadow going on here, just a subtle shadow, and some smart filters for coloring, and the shadow down here by their feet was done with custom brush work. So I can save this, place it in my main document file, and those changes will stay with me, but then I can always go back and edit them later. So anyway, you can see that I've made a lot of layers here for this project, and this is what I want to teach you, is how to create a Photoshop composite image. Let me give you a few more ideas of what's possible. So let's go ahead and open up Google, and let's search for Photoshop Composite or Photoshop Compositing, either one. There we go. And click on the images search here, and you can get a really good idea of some other things that you could do. Just some ideas to get the creative wheels spinning here in your mind. I'm going to command click on these images. So by holding down command or control on a PC here, I can click on images that I'm inspired by or that I want to talk to you about here briefly. So as I hold down command and click, what it's doing is it's opening up new tabs here, and that way I can keep browsing while I'm opening new tabs to come back to here in just a second. So, all right. So the other thing about Photoshop compositing is it doesn't have to be people. It can be products or things. Let's say you want to put something on Etsy or on eBay and you want to cut out your product and maybe make it look a little better or more appealing. This is another technique you can use for that as well. So here's an example of a product right here where we've got this piece of sod and clouds and we have these streak marks behind it. So Photoshop compositing is a great tool, and that's why we're diving in. I think it's a really fun topic. So here's a few other ideas. Let's just look real briefly. We've got some really high contrast stuff going on here. This background, I'm sure, was not where it was shot. It was probably shot on a green screen. Here's another one where he's just superimposed over the top of a background. It's not as believable, mostly because of where the shadows and the lighting are coming from, but we can talk about that as we dive in here. So here's another one, really high contrast HDR type of a photo. Again, this background was probably placed after the fact. We've even got some light bursts coming in up here and things like that. So that's what I want to show you as we dive in here. So first things first, go ahead and do a little more research, figure out what you want to make, whether it's a photo of yourself or if you want to use one of the assets I've provided. I'll provide some of these photos that you can use to cut out and work with, or feel free to take a pause real quick, take a picture of yourself. When you do, make sure, let's look at these photos I took real quick. Make sure you give yourself space to cut all the way out around the image, okay? So don't crop the image too close, so that way you have room to work. The other thing is, let's say you want to make an image. Let's just look at pexels.com. This is a great freebie resource for free images. You can search for beach or forest or city or coffee shop or any kind of a background you want to find. Let's just pretend you wanted to use this one here. If you were going to use this, let's look at where the light's coming from. It's coming from the top left here. So if you take a picture of yourself, make sure your lighting and your placement of your lighting is kind of in the same vicinity. That'll help the image look a lot more real and believable once you dive into the project here. The other thing is if you're sitting straight on, it wouldn't look quite as real as if maybe from like a 3/4 angle, so maybe sit on a stool or something. So just some ideas as you start to gather some assets and resources to create your composite image. So, all right, go ahead and take a second now, go take those photos or open up the project files and we will dive in with the next video. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you've been able to get some photos of yourself or download the resources to follow along here. I thought I would point out real quick, here's a couple Photoshop fails. You can Google Photoshop fails and find all kinds of crazy things, but I thought I'd point these two things out to you. One of which, we look at this and obviously he's not lifting this much weight. It could be believable, but if we look into the mirror, obviously it's been Photoshopped. And what about here? We've got this extra hand hanging out on the shoulder here. We've obviously cloned out somebody sitting next to her, but we forgot about the hand. So as we work through this section about Photoshop compositing, make sure you pay attention to the details. And one of the details and one of the skill sets that will help you master this section is your selections. So to get started, go ahead and grab that photo of yourself, and I'm going to just open this random photo I downloaded. I'll do a couple of these photos here that I can show you a couple different selection methods. So depending on the image you're working with, you may or may not have the perfect photo to work with. So here's an example of a couple different tools we can use. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in real quick, holding the Command and space. It's a shortcut. I could click on the zoom tool in my tools over here, but I like to work with my move tool selected, and then I'll hit spacebar to get my hand tool if I need to move around in the image, or hold down spacebar and Command to get my zoom tool. So what I'm doing now is hit the letter W to get my brush, my quick selection tool. It's kind of like a brush and a magic wand at the same time. So this is a great tool if I wanted to quickly brush out, and you'll see with an image like this, it's basically been gift wrapped to me. It's such a high contrast between the background and the foreground that I almost didn't have to do anything. So with this magic wand selected here, we've got these ants marching around here, this marquee. If I click on this background layer and hit Command J, it will jump cut it to a new layer here. Now I'm going to hold down the Command key and click on this new layer icon to put a layer below. If I just click on the new layer icon, it'll put a new layer above. So I want a new layer below. With my default swatches set over here, I'm going to hit Command Delete. Make sure I'm on layer 2 here, that blank layer. Command Delete will fill with whatever is in your background color. So now I can see I've got him cut out here on his own layer, which is fine. That works great. I'm going to double click on this library image I have over here for this background, and I could easily drag and drop. I'm going to click with my move tool, drag up towards this tab, hold for a second, come back down, and all of a sudden I've got him in the same photo. I hit Command T to get my free transform tool, and I'll drag him up a little bit. So you can see I've got this asset that I could work with. Obviously the selection as we bring it in here, it's not that great. It did miss quite a bit of the details. It's got this glow around it and wouldn't work out so good. I'm going to delete that layer. But I did want to show you, here's delete these two layers too. I did want to show you that with this brush tool we can make a quick selection. The magic wand tool is another one like that as well, where I can click once and it'll select similar colors. A better example of that would be on this Schwartz model. So if I click once over here in the gray background, it selects, right now I've got my tolerance set to 20, so about a threshold of 20 gets pretty close. If I put this up to say 50, it'll grab a lot more of those details, and then I can hold down the Shift key to add to that selection. But you'll see real quick it starts to bleed in and grab a lot more than I want it to. So if I put this tolerance back down to about 20, I'll hit Command D to deselect. Now I'm going to click once, Shift click again, and just keep Shift clicking until I get most of the selections I wanted to. So there's a lot of ways to work with selections. I don't have to come in and try and select the model. I can select around everything else, then come up to Select, Inverse. And now I've got the inverse selection, so if I back it out now, it's just selecting him. With that layer selected, I'll hit Command J to jump cut him to his own layer. I'll click and drag up back to that industrial factory photo. And there we've got him put in there. And you know, we could work with this and make it somewhat believable, but again, take a look here. We didn't clip out between his legs or between his hand. So if somebody was really paying attention, they would notice those things, especially like the detail around the hair. We missed some things, especially in this dark background. So let's try again. Let's come back over here to this selection tool, or to the, to this image here. We'll use a different selection tool. Another option we have would be like the lasso tool. So hit the letter L. There's a few different lassos we can use. The regular lasso tool is just that. We can draw with our mouse to make the selection, and this is going to be really tough to get a perfect selection. But if I wanted to, I could zoom in, hold down the Shift key and add to the selection, or hold down the Alt key to remove from the selection, and just work it back and forth until I get it, you know, pretty close to what I want it to be. This would obviously take a lot of time, but depending on what you're selecting, sometimes that's a good way to work. I'm going to deselect that. We have the polygon lasso tool, which is a nice quick way to get straight selections. Sometimes that works great for what you need to do. So I'll just make quick selections here, double click when I'm done, and it closes that off. I'll hit Command D to deselect. And then the magnetic lasso tool, that's another good one where if you have a high contrast image here, if I just start dragging right here and I kind of get it close, and I can click along the way where I want it to stick, it's kind of a sticky selection. So even if I wander out just a little bit, it still wants to snap back to that high contrast area. So that might be a good way to work. But let me show you the way that I like to work, because here's the deal. You're never going to be gift wrapped an image that's got this much contrast between it. Sometimes you're going to have an image like this, which is a great photo, but what happens if we want to put this person into a new image? Well, if we tried the quick selection tool, it is a quick selection, and sometimes it works great. So if I click and drag, it does a pretty good job of grabbing just the images or just the pixels I want. Now if I hold on the Alt key, I can remove or subtract from that selection, and it does a pretty good job. If I were to zoom in pretty close, you can see it jumped around a little bit on the hair, and you know, it forgot this backpack strap. Things that, you know, most people wouldn't even notice, but sometimes they do, and it depends on the level of complexity you're working with. So I'm just holding down Shift as I click and drag over these rocks here. It grabbed way more than I wanted, so I'm going to hit Alt and drag. So this really is an incredible tool, and sometimes it works really well. It really depends on the image. What I'm going to do is hit the letter V to get my Move tool. And I didn't even jump cut this to a new layer. With the selection, I'm just going to click and drag, and you'll see my selection, my move tool turns to an icon with the arrow and the scissors, which means I can cut it and actually move it. I'll bring it up to this tab, drop it back into this setting. I'll hit Command T to free transform and just kind of scale it up a little bit. So not a horrible selection, and if we were going to do something else with maybe a dark sky background or a mountain type of a background, let's see if I already downloaded one of those here. Let's put her in a different setting. I can just click and drag that in here real quick. Oops, that's the wrong one. There we go. All right, so scale that up a bit. I'm just going to drag this layer below the other one here. And so I could put her into this scene, and we could do some work with the lighting to lighten it up and make it look a little more believable. But the rocks really look good, and because of the detail and all of the color around it, that selection is more than sufficient. Now, here is probably one of the best ways to make a selection, and this is something I would do if I really needed to know that my selection was perfect. So here's an example of an image I used for my client, and I really wanted the image, the selection to be perfect. So what I did is I used the pen tool. Hit the letter P. We'll get our pen tool. Click up here on the top tool options bar and make sure we've got path selected. We won't want to do a shape right now. Let me show what a shape does real quick. If I click on shape, click and drag, it will make a shape, and I can change that color up here. So you can play with that later. I'm going to come over here to my paths window, click on that path, and delete it because that's not what I'm after right now. All right, now if I come back to my pen tool, the letter P, change this down to path, I can click and drag or just click. Clicking and dragging will make curves, what we call Bezier curves. If I hit Command Return, Or if I come over here to paths and command click on this icon, I'll get the marching ants again. So this is another way to make a selection, just like the other selections you've seen, but the difference is with the other selections, it was pretty tough to go back through and refine selections. Here, if I wanted to get really fine, you know, with detailed with this work, I could hit my caps lock key, which changes my cursor from the pen tool to a precise cursor. So I can click once, click and drag to bend this line, and now wherever I click, it'll follow that anchor point, and that's my actual path. So it's a little bit of a tricky tool to get used to, but you'll start to see if you can play with this a little bit on your own time and get good at it, you can create incredibly precise selections. So I'm just going to rough this one out real quick. I'm just clicking real fast just so we can move along in this tutorial here. But what I like about it is I can come in and really control exactly in how my anchor points land, and I can also move them exactly to where I want them to be. So I'm just going to make my selection here. And you can see that I can quickly zip through this, and it doesn't have to be perfect, especially if the size isn't going to be that large. But if you need it to be perfect, you could come back in, hold down the command key, click on any one of these anchor points and move it right to where it needs to be, so that way it's pixel perfect. When you're ready, come back, click on that last point you left off on, and continue on your way. If at any point you accidentally deselect your path and you can't see it, you can come over to this paths layer, click on that work path, hit the letter P. Let's try that one more time. I'll command click on this end right here. Now I've got my pen tool. I'll click, and I'm off and running again off that path that I left off on. So hopefully you can see how this could be a really great tool. See, and I didn't catch that curve right there, so I can grab this anchor point and then grab my handle and bend that out a little bit. Click once on that endpoint, click and drag, and now I'm off and running again. So it's a really great tool. Things you need to work on here: if I click and drag, it'll bend it. Or I can click once, drag to get my anchor, my handle, and then come back and click again to get a bend. I can come back over it with the Alt key selected and change my curves from a rounded curve to a hard curve. Or I can grab my direct selection tool over here, the letter A, grab those points that I don't want, hit the delete key, and delete them. So it's really flexible way to make your selections. I'm going to hit the letter P. Whoops. Hit the letter P real quick and grab that endpoint, and I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. I'll come back over and find where I started, and when I hover, I get my pen tool with the circle next to it, meaning I'm closing that path. So now with that selected, I can right click with my pen tool selected and hit make selection, which gives me the option to make a new selection, or if I already have a selection, I can subtract from the selection. I'm going to hit Command D. Or I can click on this work path here with the Command key selected to get the selection. So now if I wanted to come back to my layers, I can hit Command J to jump cut this to a new layer. And if I bring this over into my, let's see, I could bring it over anywhere I wanted to. But you can see how we can make selections, and they're pixel perfect. So what I want you to do is go ahead and spend some time cutting out your image. Try and get it to where it looks like this here. Let me grab my example real quick. So we've got this guy where he's totally cut out. All the details are removed, and we're ready to work in our new scene. Here's another example where I've gone ahead and actually cut him out completely. So go ahead and do that real quick. Get your image cut out, and then we'll dive into the next video. All right, once you've finished cutting out your photo of yourself or whatever photo you're working with, make sure you do a quick look one more time just to make sure we got everything selected. So for example, if I look at this, it looks good at the first pass, but as I zoom in here, I can see that I forgot to cut out the part around the trigger here. So I'm going to hit the letter P. I'm going to click and drag just to do a quick little selection here to grab what I forgot to select here. And I'm going to add to that selection down here. There's a couple more spots where I forgot to cut out the background. Now nobody probably would have noticed this one because it's the same color gray as the stock here. It would be a minimal mistake, but I would know, and I like to make sure that I do things as close to perfect as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up real quick. And now you've noticed I've got multiple paths going on here. If I look at my path, it's all under the same work path layer. So what I can do is command click, and now it selects that section as well as these down here. With those selected, I'll make sure I'm on the right layer, and I'll just hit the delete key to delete those pixels. I'll hit Command D to deselect. And now when I zoom out, I see that looks pretty good. And I think I got everything else. Let me look through the suspenders here. You know, nobody probably noticed this one at all, but I could come in here and clean that up just to make sure that there's nowhere in this photo that accidentally sticks out. That time I just hit Command Return, and it made my selection. I'm on this layer, I'll hit the delete key, and now I'll deselect my selection there. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm confident that no matter what background I put this on, it's going to look good. And one way to tell before you actually put it into a scene, I can hit Command and click on the new layer icon to put a new layer below it. And I'm just going to click up here in my color swatch area, and let's do a bright color, pretty obnoxious green. Make sure that layer selected, and now since I selected that, it's my foreground color. So to fill with foreground, it's Alt Delete, or come up here to Edit Fill and choose that foreground color as an option. Okay, so now I've got that green fill. So now I can come back through one more time and just kind of make sure that the selection's looking good for the most part. You know, everything's looking pretty good here. I don't see anything that I've forgotten. Oh, you know what? There's a couple things right there. And this, again, this would probably not matter. And this is where you can spend all day long. So you really have to choose how precise do you want to make your selections. But that shoelace there, Command Return. Now, if I hit delete right now, I would just be deleting from the green layer. I want to make sure that I've selected the layer with my photo. I'll hit delete. And now just what's within that selection gets deleted. Same thing over here on this part of the shoe. I can come through, highlight that. And again, honestly, like, this is the way it went to press. These little shoelace things here, if we looked at that original poster I showed you, you wouldn't even notice because the feet are on the ground and it's dark and nobody's going to see that. But again, you want to get in the habit of doing as good of a job as you can, right? You want to make a mistake and have it be an expensive mistake where somebody has to reprint something because they did notice. So, all right, now that we've got that selected, let's work on a couple techniques here to help blend this into the background. Well, for starters, let's look at the edges here. Because we use that pen tool method, this edge is super crisp and super hard. Now, that's fine, but in reality, it's not going to be a crisp image. It's going to have a little bit of a blur to it. So there's a lot of ways we can do this. Like I've said before, in Photoshop, there's 100 ways to do the same thing. One of which, if I command click on this thumbnail here, I get my selection back. I can hit the letter M to get my marching ants marquee tool, rectangular marquee tool. And with that selected, up here I've got this refine edge button. I'll click on that once. My view mode, I'll change this to, it's kind of tough to see, so I'll put it on black. I can see the edges better here. I'll click out. And now I can smooth the edges here, and it's kind of tough to see, but you can see that green bleeding through from behind. So it's smoothing out those edges, and you can feather the edges too. Excuse me. And by feathering out the images, the edges here, you can see that my selection is going to be pretty soft and blurry. I can also shift the edge in a little bit, maybe change my feather a little bit. So you can really work with that edge. If I hit OK, it's going to combine that back to a selection. So if I hit Command J, I can jump cut that new one to a layer in front. I'll turn off the eyeball here. And now when I zoom in, it went from having a very crisp, hard edge to now kind of a blurred edge, which, depending on where you're working, that might be great. But in other aspects or in other areas, it might be too much. It might cut in more than I wanted it to. So that's where you're going to need to play with it a little bit. I'm going to turn that off. Actually, let's zoom in real quick. I'll turn on the layer below it, and you can see how much crisper that edge is, especially right here. Okay, so another way to work, and this is the way that I typically work, I will grab my blur tool. So over here on the menu bar on the left, kind of midway down, I've got the blur tool. I'll set my strength pretty high, maybe 85, and then I'll just paint over the edges, just the edges, not in further than just the edges, because then I can control what blurs and what doesn't. So what I'm trying to do is just soften up these edges a little bit to help blend it in with the background. And so I can control how much gets applied. And sometimes it just needs a little bit just to sell the deal. And now here's another thing. As humans, right, we're a little more organic, so we're going to have a little bit more of a softer edge than hard metals and machinery type things. So look in nature, look at real life, and just get an idea for what should be crisp, like this rifle image here, the buttstock, versus like his clothing. His clothing is going to have a softer feel to it. So go through your edges of the photo you just did and use this blur tool and kind of soften up those images, those edges to help really convince that this selection belongs in the new background. So go ahead, take your time, go through and just brush up on the edges. So I've got my blur tool selected. I'm just clicking and dragging over the edge here. Make sure you've got that one layer selected, because here's the deal. If I'm selected the layer below it and I'm painting, you're not going to see any difference or anything happening because you're actually targeting that layer below. So make sure you've got the right layer selected and then soften up those edges again. And you can take as much time as you needed to, but just do enough to really seal the effect. And once you get that done, we'll go ahead and dive into the next video. One thing you want to make sure you're doing as we work through this project, make sure you're saving frequently just in case Photoshop crashes or your computer fails in some catastrophic event, because that will happen. At some point you'll have some kind of a deadline and then it'll crash. So make sure you're saving. All right, back to this paths window real quick. As you make your work path and as you're working through it, you'll have this work path option here. If you double click, you can name this path whatever you want. I just call mine cutout. It's just easy to remember, and it's basically my workflow on how I do everything. And simply by giving it a name, that path will stay with this image when you save it. So now I'm going to go ahead and hit File, Save, and I will drop this into my design files folder, and I just name it whatever the image was. In this case, when I've actually cut out a photo from my camera, dash cutout. So whatever the name, dash cutout. And the reason why I do that, you don't have to do that, but the reason why I do it that way is so if I ever needed to find the original, I could do a quick search for that IMG_7309 and find the original if I ever need to go back to it. So that's why I do that. I'll hit save. Again, make sure you hit it on format. You've got your on the format, you've got it set to Photoshop, and you've got your layer selected. That way you can come back through and grab this asset at any time. So I'm going to close that right now. And let's make a new document. I'll hit Command N or click on the new button here. And I'll just make another letter size paper. That worked really good if you want to do that. Or you are free to deviate and create your own size, whether you want to make something for maybe a web background like a desktop wallpaper or something. I'll hit OK. And I've got my paper size. And what I want to do, I actually want to change this. I didn't want it to be vertical, I want it to be horizontal. So I'm going to come over here to Image rotation, and I'm just going to rotate this 90 degrees clockwise since I didn't have anything on here yet. And then feel free to drop in whatever background image you want to work with, or in this case, if you want to work with one of the assets I've provided you. And I'm just going to scale this up a little bit and get it ready to go here. Perfect. Now, what we need to do is start creating this visual effect by adding in our layers or our assets. So I will open up that file that I just closed. I could have left it open, but good practice for you to find where you're putting your files. We'll open up that Photoshop file we just cut out. Click on that image, drag and drop over into your new file, and then let it go. Once we've got it in there, let's go ahead and hit Command S to save this now. And let's call it whatever you want. Composite image is great. And I'll save it in that design folder. All right, now that we're back in here, let's start with some simple housekeeping here. I'm going to hit Command T and shrink this down and get it kind of close to size. And then what I want to start working with now is the coloring of this piece. So I will come up here to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. And this will apply to whatever layer I had selected. So this camera raw filter is a great filter to use on any image, especially photography. But you can come in here and adjust the temperature, adjust the tint, Maybe it's a little underexposed or overexposed. We can add contrast, so we can really come through here and control exactly how our image looks. But before I get too far down the road here, let's just study this a little bit here. Let me Command T to shrink this down a little bit, get him a little more into the scene. Okay, and let's just think about where the light's coming from. Think about how bright things are. So the light's coming from top down, top left, or top left down to the bottom right. If we were to put this over here on the right side, to really put him into the scene, we would probably have to deal with these windows shining at some point. So we would need to, for example, I could make a quick selection around his leg here. Hit Command Return to get that selection. I'm going to hit Command L to get my levels panel. And I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit. Hit OK. Command E to deselect. And now it looks like he's standing behind that sunlight, which is great. But the problem is now as soon as I go to move him back over here, his leg has been messed up. I didn't create a way for me to work in a non-destructive manner. So what that means is as you work through things, sometimes you want, maybe let's say you wanted to save this, like you were pretty happy with it, but we wanted to try and add that light effect here. I could hit Command J to make a new layer and do that effect we just did. Again, I use my pen tool to just kind of make a quick selection here. Command Return to get it. Command L to open up my levels. And I just brightened up the whites a little bit. So that way, if for some reason I want to go back to the other version, I can just turn that layer off and open a new layer. It didn't cost me anything to do that. You can have as many layers as you want. So it's a good idea to save layers at good stages along the way. So looking at this again though, he's a little bit lighter than the background, and I could actually probably make the background a little more dark and ominous as well. So what I'll do here is I'm going to click on this industrial layer, come up to filter, and jump to my camera raw filter. And I'm going to go ahead and bring the contrast or the exposure down just a touch. I could crank the exposure, or I'm sorry, the contrast up, or bring it back to soften it up. Maybe bring my highlights down so it's not quite so bright. I could bring the shadows down or expose the shadows to make the shadows seem brighter, which then makes my highlights not seem quite as bright, and balancing out the image. So again, just play with it, just play with it and see what makes sense for your image. And when you get it to a spot that you're happy, go ahead and hit OK. And now if I hit Command Z, I can toggle between what it was and what it is now. So you can see we made it a little bit darker, a little more contrast, but now he really stands out. So let's go back and adjust this layer as well. I'll come back to that filter, camera raw filter, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here just so I can see him a little better. And I'm going to move things around just so I can see what the background looks like and try and get a better match. So we definitely need to bring down our exposure a little bit. Not too much, but definitely a little bit. And the contrast, it's probably fine where it's at. I usually come through and I grab each slider and I scrub all the way to the right, all the way to the left to try and find a good balance for where things need to be. So the whites obviously need back down just a touch. The blacks, same thing. We'll darken them up a little bit, bring up the clarity. And we'll hit OK and see what that does for us. So already it's looking a lot better, like he belongs in that environment. Now a few more things to seal the deal here. There's no shadows. If he was truly standing in this space, if we look at where some of these other shadows are coming across the room, we would need some kind of a shadow. So there's a lot of things we can do here. I could add a layer down below. Command click. Hit the letter B to get my brush tool. And let's jump over here and grab my brushes. And we'll grab a soft brush, bring my size down a little bit. Maybe a little bit bigger than that. Bring my hardness down, turn off my spacing. And up here we've got opacity and flow. We'll turn this down a little bit. If it's at 100% and I start painting with, we'll just do green so you can see it. You'll see that I get a really opaque green. Now if I bring this opacity down and start scrubbing, you see it builds up and I could keep building and adding to it. So what I could do here, I'll leave that layer, I'll add a new one. I'm going to hit the letter D to get my default swatches over here, which turns it back to black and white, or I could have double clicked on here and select a different color. But anyway, I'm just looking for black. So what I can do with this layer below the one above it, is start to paint, and you'll notice that it doesn't paint over the top of him, it paints behind. So you can build up this effect and it becomes a lot more believable if I do it that way. So we can add some drop shadow here to really kind of anchor him down to this scene. So you can paint this by hand if you want to. Another way that I work sometimes, I'll click once on this layer, Command J to duplicate it, and I'll grab the layer below. I'll hit Command T, and I'll click while holding down the mouse. Now I'll hit the the Command button, and I can warp this and bend it down. You know, depending where the light is. In this case, I don't want him back behind, but I'll just show you the effect here. And now I'll hit the return key to commit it. Now what I'm going to do is lock right here. There's this tiny lock icon. With this layer selected, I'm locking the transparency. So now what I can do is hit Alt Delete to fill with my foreground color, and it'll only fill pixels that are there. It won't fill anything around it. Now if that wasn't selected and I hit Alt Delete, it fills the whole entire layer. So Command Z, make sure my alpha transparency channel here is locked. Hit Alt Delete to fill that now. So now what I've done, I'm going to delete these layers. Now what I've done is I've created kind of a shadow here, and to further make that look real, I can bring my opacity down a little bit, maybe change my blend mode from normal to multiply, and I could even work backwards and start, you know, maybe erasing away some of the shadow, because the true shadow wouldn't necessarily go all the way across. The other thing what I like to do is I'll add a mask, a layer mask here. I'll hit the letter G to get my gradient tool. Up here I'm painting from the foreground color to transparent with a linear gradient. So what I'm going to do is, in a mask, black will hide and white will reveal. So I'm going to click from the head, come down to here, and now it's going to paint with a gradient from dark to light. So now I'm painting on this mask layer, and this mask, if I hold down Shift and click, all it's doing is masking that shadow. It's not actually destroying it, but that way I get a smooth transition from his shadow. So go ahead and bring in your subject into whatever image you have, start getting your colors right, start playing with the levels. So that was Command L to bring up maybe the brightness, or the whites and the blacks, to darken it up, or your levels here. So play with that effect a little bit. Play with your camera raw. Come up here to filter, camera raw, and try and get your background and your foreground color to be closer so they feel like they're in the same scene. We're going to do some more effects here in just a minute, but start there and then start painting in your shadows wherever you think there should be some shadow. All right, here's where the fun really begins on our Photoshop composite image project. Hopefully you've taken the time to follow along and you've got an image in place here with the background and maybe a cutout of yourself or the assets that I've provided. And you got your colors looking kind of close here. We've got maybe some shadows in place. Just to reiterate here, my shadow was just to show you how to do this effect, but realistically, you know, it's coming from the side as far as lighting, so that wouldn't be a great solution here. But anyway, take the time to get it right where you want, and now we're going to push it further. This is where the fun really begins, because you can do as much as you want. As much time as you have, you can go for it. Here's another example of a project that I made for a client. This was an actual poster we had printed. That was their battle wagon, they called it. That's a real thing. And the before photo, here, I'll move this to the side. Here's what I started with. So we actually already had some bullet shells on the ground, but the background wasn't that compelling. The sky was kind of boring, the colors were a little muted, and this landscape isn't that impressive. So what we ended up doing was bringing in some new mountain ranges, did some coloring, then I brought in some custom flames that I bought at creativemarket.com, so they were already isolated for me. I've got a little more visual interest in the sky going on here. Then I brought back in the battle wagon here, and you can see where selections really play a huge part in selling this. I actually had to cut through the glass, but you'll see now we've got this blue overshadow here, or this blue coloring, and I had to cut out right here where the bumper is. That was see-through, so the flames show through. So there's a lot of attention to detail, and even the reflection on the roof to make it look kind of real. And then I came back and created fake windows over the top, did some more coloring, added a flare layer here to kind of blend between the sky, and even added a huge moon just because I could. So it was a lot of fun to make this project. So you can see, you know, don't just stop here with a background and an image of yourself. Go ahead and add more elements. And in fact, if you wanted to, I will provide this isolated fire folder for you. So if you wanted to, you can just start bringing in maybe some fire or anything else you can imagine. And again, this has already been isolated for me, so it does a pretty good job of blending into the background. But there's some ways that we can make this look even more realistic. So one of the ways is dragging this layer behind him, maybe duplicating it or bringing in another fire object. I'll just drag and drop right over the top here. I'll scale it down, and we'll bring this layer in front of him. I'm going to hit Command and the right bracket key just to move that up one step. So now it looks like he's actually standing in the fire. We can play with this even further. If I zoom in, now I'm going to come back to this flame layer and double click. And just to clarify here, I don't want to double click on the icon. This is a smart object. If I double click there, it'll take me to the flame open in a different file in a different tab. So what we want to do is double click right here, and not in the name either, because that'll make us rename the layer. I want to click over here on the side, and that opens up my layer styles. So this is where we can add a lot of different things, especially if it was a text layer or something else. But right now, what I'm really interested in is this blend if mode. So right now I'm working on this flame in front of his foot, and I can say anything that's bright on this top layer, this layer meaning the one I'm working on, I can make it go away. I can hold down the Alt key and split this to kind of make it a smoother transition, but that doesn't look quite like what I want it to do. So I could try the dark layers, and there's really not much dark in this flame. It's all bright. That again doesn't do what I want it to. So let's try the underlying layer. I'll start dragging this back. So now anything with a light tone will start to show through. So some of those flames and the flame behind now start to peek through a little bit, and that way it looks like they're blending together. And I'll hold down the Alt key and I'll drag right from the dark layers, and now his shoe kind of starts to come back, and it's just a subtle effect, just enough to know that it's still there, but the flames are in front of it. So this is a really great trick to start blending layers together. So I'll hit OK and come back. So you could really push this a lot further. Another thing that we can do to sell this, again, our light source is from the left. So we could use the dodge and burn tools. I'm going to click once on this layer, and I'm going to rename it. So I'll just double click in here, and I'll call this original for now. Really, it's not the original. We've already done some coloring to it, but it's as close to the original as I have. I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate it. And I'm going to come over here and grab my dodge and burn tools. So the dodge tool and the burn tool, basically what they do, let's look at that. Let's look at the dodge tool first. Right now I'm working on the midtones range. My exposure is at 50%, and now as I paint over this layer, it actually exposes it and makes it brighter. So I could come along this left edge here, or any highlights that I want to really make pop, whether it's on his face, and I can paint with mid-tone exposure at 50% and basically brightening it up. So we're essentially painting with light, and that's one of the biggest fundamental keys when you're doing Photoshop composite images and you see some of those really extreme HDR merge types of things. A lot of times it's just painting with light or dark, and I can turn this off and see where I've painted. Another way to work is I could turn that layer off. Let's duplicate this original layer again, and I could grab my layers, or I'm sorry, my levels, Command L, and I could just come in here and really crank up the details this way. And I'll use a layer mask. I'll click on this layer mask. If I click right now, nothing happens. It just adds a mask to be filled. If I Alt click, it actually fills that with black by default, so you can't see it. Everything's been hidden. So now I can hit the B to get my brush tool. And because black hides and white reveals, I can swap this right here. I'll hit the letter X to swap my foreground and background colors, or I can hit this tiny little double arrow to swap which one's in front, but I basically want to be painting with white. So as I come through here and I start painting, I'm actually unmasking or revealing the layer below it. Now up here I've got my opacity set to 12%, so you're really not seeing any change. I'm just going to scrub that back up to 100% so we can see. I'm going to make sure I'm painting on my mask layer here. And then one other thing is I got to make sure my blend mode is set to normal up here so we see what's going on. There we go. Now that's a pretty harsh brush. I could come back in, drop this opacity down quite a bit, and just make some subtle changes here. And the benefit of working this way is if I change my mind or if I get too much, I can just hit the letter X to swap, and now I'm painting with black, and I can come back in and reverse my mask. So this way is a lot less destructive. It's a nice way to add some highlights or some dark tones. So let's go ahead and do some dark tones now. If I grab my original layer and I'll hit Command J, there's a couple ways I could work here. Let's finish that other dodge burn section. I'll come back over to my dodge burn tool, and now I'm going to use my burn tool, and I can burn my highlights, my midtones, or my shadows, whatever you want to do. I'll select my midtones, and now as I start painting over this, it just burns the layer. So it just adds more depth, and I probably want to burn the right side a little bit to make it darker. And right now I'm mostly showing you technique. This doesn't look that fantastic, but you can play with this depending on what your image needs, and if maybe you need to work on the shadows or the highlights, you can just change the range, and now it'll only affect the highlight tones but not really the darker tones. So it's a really nice way to really refine what you're doing here. But again, I like to work non-destructively, so what I'm going to do is duplicate that original layer one more time, Command J, and I'm going to change my blend mode to multiply, and now it's multiplying that layer and making everything dark behind it. That's one way to get it looking dark. The other way, I can come back to my layer, my levels, Command L, and I could scrub here to bring in some darks, but maybe pull back a little bit on the mid-tone, so I'm just really dealing with the dark tones. Like I said, there's a lot of ways to do the same thing. So now I'm going to add a layer mask to this. I'm going to hold Alt and click on my mask. So now that dark tone has gone away. Make sure I'm painting on that mask layer with my brush tool. And I'm going to hit X to swap my foreground, so it's painting with white to reveal. So I can come in here and start adding some of those dark tones if I wanted to, really sell the fact that there's a shadow on this side. And you can see right away I do have some color issues here. So it's one of those things where depending on your image and what's in the image and what effect you're trying to get, you might need to use multiple techniques. The dodge and burn, you might need to use the blend modes over here to get different effects, and masking. So these are all great ways to work, but to really try and sell that effect. And again, you're going to need to experiment with what makes sense in your image. So I don't like the shadows I did there. I'm just going to turn it off, and I don't mind those bright colors. The flame thing is a little, obviously a little ridiculous, but just wanted to show you that you can work elements back and forth and bring in some different things. Now, if this truly was on fire here, his leg would be glowing on this side. So what I'm going to do is Command click on this layer to get a selection. I'm going to click on the new layer icon right here to get a layer in front of it. And I'm going to, let's see, there's a few ways we could do this. I could sample, I'm going to use the letter I to get a sample of this color, this yellow color. Hit B to get my brush tool, and maybe drag my opacity down quite a bit and just kind of start to add some yellow highlights there. Maybe get the letter I again to sample a different color within that, and just kind of work in some different colors here. And then I can play with my blend mode there. I'll come over here to my blend modes, and this just changes how the layers interact with each other, how they blend. Whatever's on top blending with what's below. So a shortcut I like to use, with your move tool selected, the letter V, on the layer you want to change. Now if I just hit shift and the plus sign, or shift and minus, I can step back and forth between these here and get a quick idea of what's going to look good. So hold down shift and plus, and I just cycle real quickly and see what color mode might interact to get the most realistic effect there. Oops. So, and once I get something that I'm happy with, and this is total preference, just whatever you want to do, I can leave it there. I can even push this a little bit further. Maybe I grab this flame, hold down the Alt key to drag a copy over here, Command T to just change it a little bit here, and maybe even reflect it. I'll right click and I'll flip horizontal. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is come back down to this layer, and you can see I'm starting to get a lot of layers. So what I'll do is I'll tear this off so I can see more. All right, so this flame and this layer is what I'm working with here. So I'm going to drag this down, and there's a few things I could do. I could hold on the Alt key and click between here, and what that does is it uses whatever layers below as a mask. If I want to undo it, I'll hold on Alt and click between the layers. So that's an easy way to, now I can move this layer around, and you'll see it's masked by the shape below it. Another way I could work is, well, that's actually probably my favorite way to work right now. But now I can add a layer mask to this here. and I can start to paint with black to hide some of this, and I need to drag my opacity back up here. And I can start to remove some of this here. And I just want this to be a subtle effect. So I'm going to scrub my opacity for that layer down quite a bit, actually. I just want it to be barely even, just barely a hint that it's even there at all. And those are the little details that as you build up more and more will start to really sell the effect that this is really happening. So play with that, whether it's flames or putting it in a different environment. Get that where you want it to go. Use your dodge and burn tools. And now what we want to do is try and bring all of this into one cohesive image. So ways to do that. Now we want to affect this entire image. We did some of that with the color correcting, but now we're going to look at adjustment layers. So let's go ahead and come down here to this little icon. We'll click once on it. And let's start with the photo filter adjustment layer. I'll click once on that, and it adds it right above whatever layer I had selected. And you'll notice, so it affects the background image, but it doesn't do anything to my flames or to the guy standing here. So what I'm going to do is drag this adjustment layer all the way to the top, and now it'll affect everything down below it. And if I toggle this on and off real quick, it's a pretty subtle difference, but it does affect the coloring of the image, and it starts to make it feel more cohesive. If I double click on that, I can see I have some different mask options. If I double click on the camera, it brings me over to the properties of that adjustment layer. So I can change to different filters, some different presets, and you'll see they all have different effects on the image. So what I like to do is probably leave this on this yellow or maybe the warming filter just to get a subtle effect here. Let's add another adjustment layer. This time I'm going to do the hue saturation. And there's some different presets, some different things you can play with. You can work on the saturation to really pull out some of the colors. If you pull it too far, it turns it into a black and white image. Too far the other direction and it really starts to look terrible. So play with that a little bit, maybe bump it down just a touch. You can work with the overall lightness of the image. But you'll notice it's affecting everything, every layer. And what this will help do for your image is make it feel like the photo was taken at the same place at the same time. Or we can jump over here to the preset. I like the old style, and that helps really make it feel like it's part of the same image. Now this is a little bit too far. It's probably because I've got this photo filter here. If I turn that off, you'll notice it brings back a little bit of that, and you just need to play with it. Maybe grab this layer and drop the opacity just a touch so it's affecting the layer but not completely, not at 100% strength. And that'll help just all these little details as you build them up really sell the image. So now that you've done that, go ahead and push this as far as you want and make sure you save along the way as you go. And the other thing we can do here, let me jump real quick into that nerd poster I made, is you can add layers to the very top of this. So right now I've got this effect. It's very, very subtle, but it's a little burst image. Let me show you. I've got it locked. So I'll unlock this layer, turn my opacity all the way up and my fill all the way up. And you see I've got a blend mode again set to overlay. So it overlays the color on top of the layers below it. If I change it back to normal, you see it's basically a gradient, like a radial solar flare. And the whole reason that this is on this image, let me change it back to overlay, drop down my fill and my opacity, and you can see it's super, super subtle effect, but what it helps do is color all of it. If I turn it back off, you can see not all the coloring on these people look quite right with the background. So by putting this over the top of it, it really helps darken this top right area but brighten this like there was one unified light source. So that's basically what we're doing with this layer, is creating a light source now that helps the whole image look unified. These adjustment layers over here, these help the coloring look consistent, and now we want to bring the light source from one spot. So there's a lot of ways to do this. I just happen to use this solar flare thing, so I'm going to drag and drop this over the top of everything in this new image here. Command T to scale it up and resize it where it needs to be. And as I scale, you can kind of see those lens flares coming, but it almost works out perfect for where the light source in this factory is coming from. So I'm going to scale it to get it pretty close. I'll hit return, and now it made my overall image pretty dark. So there's a few things I can do. I can just drag the opacity down, or I'm going to come back over here with my move tool selected, hold on Shift and plus to cycle through some different effects here. Some of these are more believable than others. Some of these are totally unusable. This pin light might be nice if you're really wanting to keep that solar flare effect. But again, every image is different. So just cycle through and see what effect gives you the best results on your image. And right now it's looking like, the other thing I got to look at too is what it's doing to his face, right? So it's looking like lighten might be a good solution. That one's not bad. Color dodge. What's this one? Linear dodge. So just play with it, see what works best. And then again, back off your settings just a little bit so it's not such an overkill effect. And it's all these subtleties that add up to create a really compelling composite image. So good luck with that. Go ahead and press on, get your image just how you like it. Be sure you save along the way. And in the next lesson, we'll take a quick look at exporting what we've completed. All right, now that we're pretty much finished with our image and you've learned some different techniques for the Photoshop compositing, I actually had another idea I wanted to show you real quick as I was looking at this image, and maybe you've already thought of this. What I'm going to do first is lock this top layer. Otherwise, as I try to select things, it's only going to select the layer on top. So I'm going to click on this little lock icon. And now I can select what's below it. I thought about this, like what if we had this guy dangling over like a fire pit or something? So I'm going to drag him up, and you'll notice that the other effects I applied didn't come with it. So before I get too far here, let's grab the layers that I used to create this effect. Let's grab the layers of him, and I'm not going to grab the flame right now. I'll grab the original. And there's a couple ways we could do this. I could group them, Command G to group them into one group. And you'll notice his shadow didn't come with that. Let's click on that layer to see which one that is. Okay, so there's that layer. So I'm just going to drag it up here, put it inside that folder. So now that all comes together. The other thing I could do is shift click to highlight all of those. We'll right click, and now I'll link these layers. So you'll see these little chain link with all these layers. So now I can click and drag anywhere and they all stick together. So what I'm thinking is I could bring him up here a little bit. And since he's in the air, that shadow doesn't make sense anymore. So let's turn that off and maybe turn him a little bit. I could even click and then hold down the command key after I click to maybe, well, that doesn't look too real anymore. But what I was thinking is having him like dangling up here, and I could bring this hook down from the background. So let's select that real quick. I'm going to right click. This is tied to my Creative Cloud. So I'm going to right click and rasterize this layer, basically bring it in and flatten it into this image. And let's do a quick selection around this thing. I don't want to take too much time, so I'm just going to hit let's try the quick selection tool, and let's just kind of paint real quick. I just want to see if this effect even works like I want it to. Holding down the Alt key to refine that. Now what I'm going to do is move this down, and there's a few ways we can go about it. But if I come over to let's find this real quick, the Content Aware Move tool. So it's letter J gets us there. I can click and drag this down a little bit. Let's just put it down here, and I'll let go, and let's see how good a job Photoshop does. Not too bad. We need to refine this a little bit, but you'll see that it filled in the background with the bricks. Gets a pretty decent effect. I hit Command D to deselect, and now if I wanted to, I could come back in here, and there's a few different ways we can do it. What I like to do is get my lasso tool. I'll click and drag around right here, and then Control Shift Delete brings up my fill. And instead of filling with foreground color, I'm going to fill with Content Aware. I'll select that and hit OK, and now it starts to fill in with the background to remove some of these lines from what was left over. So I'm just clicking and dragging, Control Shift Delete to bring up my fill. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because you could play with this all day long. But anyway, you can see I've effectively moved down that hook, and you could actually find a fresh image maybe to do a better job. And then I could come back in here and maybe paint in some of these cables with just the brush tool, or there's a lot of ways to do it. But now make it look like maybe he's hanging from his suspenders or something ridiculous like that over the fire. So hopefully that's not too sinister, but I don't know. It's where my mind went looking at this image. So have fun with it. Keep pushing it on. And when you're all done, make sure you save your editable PSD file. So just Command S to save that real quick. And then when you want to show your friends and family what you've been up to, come up here to File, Export, Export As. and we can really control the settings of this image by changing the quality or the file type. And you can see right here, this would be 2.1 megabytes, which is great. I can hit export and it'll spit out a JPEG for me. I can put it right where I need to go. We'll put my files sent. I'll hit export, and now it's saved out a JPEG that I can share with whomever wants to see this thing.